evening, dear friends who find comfort in the gentle corners of the past. Whether you're settling down for the night or stealing a peaceful moment from your day, welcome to this quiet space we share. I'm so glad you're here with me tonight, ready to explore a story that most history books would call ordinary, unremarkable, perhaps even boring. But as we'll discover together, the most profound changes often happen not with fanfare and drama, but in the soft clicking of typewriter keys and the whispered conversations between women who dared to dream of something more. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. I love knowing that we're connected across time zones and continents by these simple stories. And if these gentle journeys through forgotten history bring you peace, please do consider subscribing. There are so many quiet revolutions waiting to be remembered, so many ordinary heroes whose stories deserve to be whispered into the night. Our story unfolds in the summer of 1952, in the heart of Midtown Manhattan, on the 32nd floor of the Chrysler Building. Here, in a vast room filled with perfectly aligned desks, sat 87 women, each positioned behind an identical black Underwood typewriter, their fingers dancing across the keys in a rhythm that sounded almost like rainfall against windows, or perhaps like the heartbeat of the city itself. This was the typing pool of Meridian Insurance Company, the largest such operation in New York City, and quite possibly the most efficient document processing center in the world. Letters, reports, policies, and contracts flowed through this room like water through a dam, transformed by skilled fingers from handwritten drafts into perfectly formatted correspondence that would travel to every corner of America and beyond. But to understand how this quiet revolution began, we must first understand the world these women inhabited. A world where the very act of earning one's own living was still considered temporary for most women, where intelligence and ambition were qualities to be hidden rather than displayed, where the phrase, "just a secretary," carried all the weight of societal expectations about a woman's proper place. The year 1952 marked a peculiar moment in American history. The war had ended 7 years earlier, bringing with it a great reshuffling of social expectations. Women who had worked in factories, offices, and laboratories during the conflict were now expected to return quietly to domestic roles, to find fulfillment in suburban kitchens and perfectly manicured lawns. But not all women had husbands waiting for them, and not all who did were ready to abandon the independence they had discovered during those war years. The typing pool at Meridian Insurance was filled with such women, some who had never married, others whose husbands had not returned from overseas, still others who had discovered that marriage and career could coexist if one was careful, strategic, and very, very quiet about one's ambitions. To the casual observer, the executives, who occasionally walked through on their way to more important meetings, the maintenance workers who emptied the wastebaskets each evening, the delivery boys who brought fresh ribbons, and carbon paper. These women were interchangeable parts in a great machine. As uniform and predictable as the typewriters they operated, they had the same neat hairstyles, the same pressed blouses and pencil skirts, the same quiet efficiency that made the whole operation hum along without requiring much attention from the men who ran the company. But if you had listened more carefully, if you had paid attention to the subtle variations in typing rhythm, the almost imperceptible glances exchanged between desks, the way certain women would pause fractionally longer when typing particular words, you might have realized that something extraordinary was happening in that ordinary room, something that would challenge not just the operations of one insurance company, but the very assumptions about women, work, and power that governed American business in the 1950s. At the center of this quiet revolution sat Dorothy Me Henderson, known to her friends as Dot, a 38-year-old woman from a small Tennessee town called Cookeville. Dot had arrived in New York 15 years earlier with nothing but a high school diploma, $97 in savings, excellent typing skills, and a determination to build a life that was entirely her own. A radical notion for a young woman from the rural South in 1937. Her journey to Manhattan had begun on a sweltering August morning when she walked into the offices of the Cookeville Herald and announced to the editor that she was the fastest typist in 3 counties and that she would work for free for 1 week to prove it. The editor, a kind man named Samuel Morrison, who had daughters of his own, was impressed enough by her confidence to give her a chance. Within a month, Dot was not only typing the newspaper's copy, but also writing headlines, editing articles, and managing the subscription lists with an efficiency that doubled the paper's output. But Cookeville, Tennessee, was not a place where a young woman's ambitions could expand indefinitely. There was one newspaper, one bank, one telephone company, and a handful of other businesses that might employ someone with secretarial skills. Dot could see her entire future stretched out before her like a straight, narrow road with no interesting turns. So when her elderly Aunt Rose left her a small inheritance, enough to cover train fare to New York, and perhaps 2 months rent in a boarding house, Dot made the decision that would define the rest of her life. She arrived at Pennsylvania Station on a crisp September morning in 1937, carrying a single suitcase and an Underwood portable typewriter that had been her high school graduation gift. The city was overwhelming in its size, noise, and complexity. But Dot had not come seeking comfort. She had come seeking possibility. Her first job was at a small law firm in the financial district, typing wills and contracts for lawyers who barely acknowledged her existence. She earned $28 a week, lived in a tiny room in a boarding house for women on the Upper East Side, and spent her evenings exploring the city, learning its rhythms, understanding how its systems worked. Within 6 months, she had moved to a larger firm with better pay. Within a year, She was working for a prestigious corporate law practice where she typed documents for some of the most important business deals in the city. And everywhere she worked, Dot observed. She learned how businesses functioned, how deals were structured, how money flowed through the complex networks of corporate America. When the war came in 1941, it created opportunities that had never existed before. Companies were desperate for skilled workers as men left for military service. Dot found herself recruited by Meridian Insurance Company with an offer that seemed too good to believe. $35 a week, 2 weeks of paid vacation, and a position in what they called their executive typing pool, a step above ordinary secretarial work. Meridian in 1942 was a different place than it would become by 1952. The war had forced everyone to be more flexible, more willing to let talented people contribute regardless of their official job titles. Dot quickly discovered that she had an almost supernatural ability to understand insurance as a business. She could read a policy application and predict with startling accuracy whether the applicant would file claims. She could spot errors in actuarial calculations that had been missed by college-educated mathematicians. She could analyze market trends by studying the patterns in the correspondence she typed. But as the war ended and the men returned to reclaim their positions, the atmosphere at Meridian began to change. The flexibility and opportunity that had characterized the early 1940s gave way to a more rigid hierarchy, a more traditional understanding of who was qualified to make decisions and contribute ideas. Dot watched as her informal influence diminished, as her suggestions were politely acknowledged but rarely implemented, as the company returned to a structure that valued credentials over competence and gender over intelligence. By 1952, Dot had been promoted to senior pool supervisor, making $58 a week plus benefits, a respectable salary for a woman, but still less than the starting salary for any male college graduate hired into the company's management training program. She supervised the work of 86 other women, coordinated the flow of documents through the entire organization, and possessed a more comprehensive understanding of Meridian's operations than most of the vice presidents. Dot was a small woman with prematurely gray hair that she wore pulled back in a practical bun, and hands that moved over typewriter keys with the fluid grace of a concert pianist. But her most remarkable feature was her eyes, sharp, intelligent, constantly observing, missing nothing. She had the kind of mind that could track 17 different projects simultaneously while mentally composing the shopping list for her elderly neighbor Mrs. Chen and planning the logistics for her nephew's upcoming wedding back in Tennessee. What made Dot extraordinary was not just her analytical abilities, but her understanding of how to navigate the complex social dynamics of a business organization. She had learned to present her insights in ways that allowed male executives to take credit for them, to phrase her suggestions as questions rather than recommendations, to use her knowledge to solve problems while making it appear that the solutions had emerged naturally from the existing management structure. This was survival, pure and simple. Dot had seen too many capable women fired or marginalized because they had been too direct in challenging decisions, too obvious in demonstrating their competence, too willing to claim credit for their contributions. She had learned that in the business world of the 1950s, a woman's intelligence was most effective when it was largely invisible, when it operated through influence rather than authority, when it achieved its goals while maintaining the illusion that men were in control. Sitting at the desk, immediately to Dot's left, was Evelyn Kowalski, a 26-year-old Polish-American woman from Chicago, whose story embodied the particular challenges faced by working-class women who possessed exceptional abilities but lacked the social connections that might have opened different doors. Evelyn's parents had immigrated to the United States in 1920, settling in a Polish neighborhood on Chicago's South Side, where her father worked in the stockyards, and her mother took in sewing to supplement the family income. Evelyn was the eldest of 5 children, and from an early age, it was understood that her job was to help support the family rather than pursue education for its own sake. But Evelyn possessed a mathematical mind that was extraordinary by any standard. She could perform complex calculations in her head, understand statistical relationships that eluded trained accountants, and spot patterns in data that revealed insights about business trends and customer behavior. Her high school mathematics teacher, a woman named Miss Patricia Sullivan, had recognized Evelyn's exceptional abilities and had fought to get her a scholarship to the University of Chicago. The scholarship would have covered tuition, but not living expenses, and the Kowalski family could not afford to lose Evelyn's potential earnings for 4 years. So instead of college, Evelyn attended a 6-month secretarial program, learning to type 90 words per minute and take shorthand at speeds that impressed even her instructors. Her first job was with a manufacturing company in Chicago, where her typing skills quickly earned her recognition, but where her mathematical insights were neither sought nor appreciated. When her fiancé, a young man named Robert, who worked at a steel plant, decided to move to New York in search of better opportunities, Evelyn saw her own chance for a fresh start. But New York in 1949 proved challenging for both of them. Robert's job at a Queens manufacturing plant paid less than he had hoped, and he began to resent the fact that Evelyn's position at Meridian Insurance was more prestigious and better compensated than his own work. The relationship that had seemed solid in Chicago began to strain under the pressures of a new city, financial stress, and Robert's growing discomfort with dating a woman who earned more money than he did. The breaking point came on a February evening in 1950, when Evelyn mentioned that she had been asked to help the accounting department resolve some discrepancies in their quarterly reports, work that was technically outside her job description, but that utilized her mathematical abilities in ways that she found deeply satisfying. Robert's response was swift and bitter. "You're getting too big for your britches, Evie. No man wants a wife who thinks she's smarter than everyone else. If you keep this up, you're going to end up alone." Evelyn looked at Robert across their small kitchen table. This man she had thought she would marry, who had seemed so supportive of her ambitions when success felt distant and theoretical, and realized that he was probably right. She was likely to end up alone, at least if alone meant free to use her mind, free to contribute meaningfully to work that mattered, free to be valued for her intelligence, rather than diminished by it. "Then I guess I'll end up alone," she said quietly. And the next morning, she returned the engagement ring he had given her. By 1952, Evelyn had not only survived as a single working woman in New York, but had thrived. She had worked her way up to assistant pool supervisor, earned a reputation as the fastest and most accurate typist in the company, and had begun teaching herself advanced accounting principles by studying textbooks she borrowed from the public library. Evelyn was tall and angular, with auburn hair that she kept shorter than fashion dictated, and a wardrobe of sensible suits that she made herself on weekends using patterns from McCall's magazine. She lived in a small but comfortable apartment in Queens, spent her evenings reading books about business and mathematics, and had developed a network of friendships with other working women who understood that independence required both courage and careful financial planning. What made Evelyn special wasn't just her typing speed, though at 127 words per minute with perfect accuracy, she was genuinely remarkable. It was her mathematical mind and her ability to see patterns that others missed. She could add long columns of figures in her head faster than most people could with adding machines. She could spot errors in calculations that had been approved by the accounting department. She could understand the statistical relationships buried in insurance data that revealed trends the trained actuaries had missed. She had been quietly correcting minor errors in financial documents for 3 years, changes so subtle that no one had noticed the improvements, but that had prevented several potentially costly mistakes. She had developed her own informal system for tracking the productivity patterns of different departments, identifying which policies and procedures actually helped people work more effectively. She had even taught herself the basics of actuarial science by studying the company manuals during her lunch breaks, and she had begun to understand the mathematical principles that governed insurance risk assessment. But like Dot, Evelyn had learned that her mathematical insights were most effective when they were presented indirectly, when they appeared to emerge from collaborative discussions rather than from her individual analysis. She had watched other women be dismissed as too technical or overly analytical when they had tried to contribute mathematical perspectives to business discussions. She had learned to phrase her insights as questions, like, "I wonder if we might want to double-check these figures," rather than as direct corrections. 3 rows behind Evelyn sat Ruth Patterson, a 42-year-old African-American woman whose presence at Meridian Insurance represented both progress and profound limitation, both opportunity and ongoing injustice. Ruth's position was precarious in ways that her white colleagues could understand intellectually, but could never fully experience emotionally. Ruth had been born in rural North Carolina in 1910, the daughter of sharecroppers who possessed little formal education, but a tremendous respect for learning. Her parents had sacrificed considerably to keep her in school, understanding that education represented the only possible path away from the cycles of rural poverty that had trapped previous generations. Ruth had been an exceptional student, particularly gifted in languages and literature. She had learned to read before she started school, devouring every book she could find, developing a sophisticated understanding of grammar, syntax, and the subtle ways that word choice could convey meaning and emotion. Her teachers, recognizing her exceptional abilities, had encouraged her to apply to one of the historically black colleges that were beginning to expand their enrollment in the 1920s. But college required resources that her family simply could not provide. And Ruth's dreams of higher education had to be balanced against immediate economic necessities. Instead of college, she had attended a 2-year program at a secretarial school in Charlotte, where her intelligence and linguistic abilities had quickly distinguished her from other students. Her first job had been with a black-owned insurance company in Charlotte, where she had learned the basics of the insurance business, while also discovering her particular talent for written communication. She could take the most complex policy language and translate it into terms that ordinary customers could understand. She could draft letters that conveyed difficult news with compassion and clarity. She could diffuse angry complaints with carefully chosen words that acknowledged customers' frustrations while protecting the company's interests. When World War II created labor shortages throughout the country, Ruth had seen an opportunity to move beyond the limited possibilities available in the segregated South. In 1943, she had used her savings to travel to New York, where defense contractors and other businesses were, for the first time in American history, actively recruiting qualified black workers. Meridian Insurance had hired Ruth in 1943, making her one of the first African-American women employed in their clerical operations. The decision had not been made out of progressive idealism, but out of practical necessity. They needed skilled workers, and Ruth's qualifications were undeniable. But her hearing had been controversial within the company, and her position remained tenuous in ways that affected every aspect of her daily work life. Ruth earned $42 a week in 1952, substantially less than white women with similar experience and abilities. She was assigned the most challenging correspondence in the typing pool, the letters that dealt with what the company euphemistically called special situations. These included claims that involved unusual circumstances, policies that required delicate explanations, and letters to clients who were challenging company decisions. The work required not only technical accuracy, but also sophisticated judgment about tone, emphasis, and diplomatic phrasing. Ruth had developed extraordinary skills in transforming harsh rejection letters into communications that were firm but compassionate, in explaining complex policy provisions in language that customers could understand, in diffusing conflicts through careful word choice and empathetic acknowledgement of customer concerns. Her letters had the lowest complaint rates in the entire company, and several clients had specifically requested that their correspondence be handled by that wonderful woman who writes such clear and helpful letters. But Ruth's successes had to be achieved within strict constraints. She could not afford to make any mistakes that might be attributed to incompetence or carelessness. She could not express any opinions that might be interpreted as challenging management decisions. She could not participate in the informal social networks that helped other women advance within the company. She had to be not just competent, but exceptional. And she had to make her exceptional performance appear effortless and natural. Ruth lived in Harlem, in a small apartment that she shared with her widowed sister, Clara, and Clara's 3 children. Ruth's salary supported not only herself, but also contributed significantly to the household expenses, and the loss of her job would have been catastrophic for the entire extended family. This economic pressure, combined with the social realities of being one of only 4 Black women in a company of several hundred employees, meant that Ruth had to navigate her professional life with extraordinary care and strategic thinking. But Ruth possessed qualities that made her an invaluable member of the typing pool's informal leadership structure. She had a gift for understanding people, for reading the subtle emotional currents that flowed through workplace interactions, for recognizing when someone was struggling or needed support, for finding ways to help colleagues solve problems without creating the impression that she was overstepping her boundaries. She also had a comprehensive understanding of the insurance business that went far beyond her official job responsibilities. Ruth read every document that passed through her typewriter, not just for accuracy, but for comprehension. She understood the legal principles that governed insurance contracts, the financial calculations that determined premium rates, and the regulatory requirements that shaped company policies. She had taught herself to think like a business analyst, while maintaining the outward appearance of someone who was simply following instructions. These 3 women, Evelyn and Ruth, formed the unofficial leadership of the typing pool, though their authority was never formally recognized, and they were careful never to let it show too obviously. They communicated through a complex system of glances, subtle shifts in typing rhythm, and coded phrases that allowed them to coordinate the flow of work, help colleagues who were struggling, and maintain the appearance of effortless efficiency that management expected. But their leadership extended far beyond simple work coordination. They had created an informal mentoring system that helped new employees learn not just how to do their jobs, but how to navigate the complex social dynamics of the workplace. They had developed strategies for dealing with difficult executives, techniques for presenting ideas in ways that would be taken seriously, and methods for supporting each other through the various challenges that working women faced in the 1950s. The typing pool itself was a fascinating social ecosystem that reflected many of the broader tensions and contradictions of American society in the early 1950s. The 87 women who worked there came from remarkably diverse backgrounds, representing a cross-section of ethnicities, religions, and social classes that would have been unlikely to interact in most other. For example, the duplicate information Harrison wanted to eliminate often served important functions. A client's address might appear in multiple places because different types of correspondence needed to be sent to different locations, or because a client had moved and the company needed to track both current and former addresses. A policy number might be referenced in several different formats because different departments used different coding systems. The filing system also incorporated informal knowledge accumulated over years of customer interactions, notes about client preferences, reminders about special circumstances, warnings about potential problems. This information was not systematically documented, but it was embedded in the structure of the files themselves, in the way documents were arranged, in the marginalia that experienced clerks had added over time. Most importantly, the existing system was designed to accommodate exceptions and changing circumstances in ways that rigid standardization would make impossible. Insurance is a business that deals constantly with special cases. The filing system at Meridian was flexible enough to handle this complexity, while Harrison's proposed replacement was designed for theoretical efficiency rather than practical adaptability. Henderson realized all of this within hours of receiving Harrison's detailed instructions. She could see dozens of ways the new system would actually make the typing pool's work more difficult and less effective. The standardized formats would eliminate important context. The new cross-reference system would create redundant work. The rigid categorization would force complex client relationships into oversimplified templates that would make it harder, not easier, to locate relevant information. Most problematically, the entire project was based on Harrison's assumption that filing was a simple clerical task. He didn't understand that the women who managed these files were actually performing complex analytical work, interpreting information, making judgments about relevance, and using their accumulated knowledge to solve problems. But Dot also realized that simply pointing out these flaws to Harrison would accomplish nothing. He had already committed to the project in front of the board, staking his reputation on its success. Even if she could convince him that he was wrong, he would never be able to publicly acknowledge that 87 mere typists understood the business better than a Harvard MBA. Moreover, challenging his plan directly would put Dot and her colleagues at risk. Women who questioned management too openly were often labeled as difficult or insubordinate, characterizations that could quickly lead to termination. The social and professional constraints of the 1950s meant that direct confrontation was rarely an effective strategy. This was the moment when Dot made the decision that would change not only her own life, but the lives of every woman in the typing pool, and eventually the entire structure of Meridian Insurance Company. Instead of fighting Harrison's plan directly, she would implement it exactly as he had specified. But she would simultaneously conduct a comprehensive analysis, documenting every inefficiency, every error, and every waste of time and resources that resulted from following his instructions to the letter. It was a strategy that required extraordinary discipline. Dot would have to maintain perfect outward compliance while secretly building a case that could demonstrate the superiority of alternative approaches. She would have to document problems without creating the impression of sabotage. She would have to gather evidence while ensuring her analysis could not be traced back to her if management discovered what was happening. That evening, Dot stayed late, sitting alone in the empty typing pool as the summer sun set over Manhattan. The great room was quiet, except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant rumble of traffic 32 floors below. Dot inserted a fresh sheet of paper into her own Underwood typewriter and began to compose what she privately called the report. This would be a detailed analysis of the current filing system, the proposed changes, and the likely consequences of implementing Harrison's plan. Dot wrote with the accumulated wisdom of 15 years of watching how information actually moved through the company, of understanding which procedures worked and which didn't. She wrote about the hidden complexities Harrison's analysis had missed, the informal knowledge networks that made the current system functional, the ways that rigid standardization would eliminate the flexibility essential for handling exceptional cases. She wrote about the real costs of the proposed changes, not just the obvious expenses of the summer-long project, but the ongoing inefficiencies that would result from a system poorly suited to the actual needs of the business. Most importantly, she wrote with the knowledge that this report would never see the light of day if submitted through normal channels. Management would either ignore it or dismiss it as the uninformed opinions of someone lacking the education to understand complex business issues. So instead, she was creating a shadow analysis that would run parallel to Harrison's official project, documenting in precise detail the gap between management theory and operational reality. Dot worked for 3 hours that evening, and when she finally stopped, She had produced 12 pages of the most comprehensive critique of a business reorganization plan ever written by someone in her position. But she also knew the report was only the beginning. To be truly effective, her analysis needed to be supported by systematic documentation of actual results, evidence that could not be dismissed as mere speculation. The next morning, Dot arrived at the office earlier than usual and set about implementing the second phase of her plan. She gathered Evelyn Kowalski and Ruth Patterson in the small supply closet that served as their unofficial meeting space, and she explained her proposal in whispered tones. "We're going to implement Harrison's plan exactly as he specified," Dot explained. "But we're also going to document everything that goes wrong, every inefficiency, every problem his new system creates. We're going to build a case that shows why the current system works better, but we're going to do it in a way that can't be traced back to us." She emphasized the risks. They would be documenting management failures and challenging executive decisions. If their activities were discovered, they could all be fired. Ruth's situation was particularly precarious because of the additional vulnerability that came with being one of the few Black women in the company. "If they find out what we're doing, we could all lose our jobs," Dot said quietly. "And Ruth, you know your position is more fragile than ours. No one would blame you for staying out of this." Ruth was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications. She thought about her sister Clara and her 3 children, about the rent that had to be paid and the groceries that had to be bought, about the limited options available to a Black woman in 1950s New York if she lost her job at a respectable company like Meridian. But she also thought about the years she had spent typing other people's words, implementing other people's decisions, watching as her insights were ignored. She thought about the waste she witnessed daily, the missed opportunities, the problems that could be solved if only someone would listen. Then Ruth spoke with the careful precision that characterized all of her communications. "I've been typing other people's words for 20 years. Maybe it's time I helped write some of my own." Evelyn simply nodded her agreement. "When do we start?" And so began the most extraordinary summer in the history of the Meridian Insurance Company typing pool. On the surface, everything appeared normal. The women arrived each morning at their assigned desks, inserted fresh ribbons into their typewriters, and began the systematic work of implementing Operation Clean Slate. Harrison made his daily rounds through the pool, checking progress and offering encouragement, pleased to see his modernization plan proceeding smoothly. But beneath this surface of compliance, a parallel operation was unfolding with the precision of a military campaign. Dot, Evelyn, and Ruth had carefully recruited 12 other women into their shadow project. Typists who had demonstrated not only exceptional skills, but also the discretion and judgment necessary for such a delicate undertaking. The selection process had been subtle, conducted through whispered conversations and coded exchanges. Dot had observed her colleagues for months, identifying women who showed signs of frustration with the inefficiencies they witnessed daily, who possessed analytical abilities that went beyond their job descriptions, and who had demonstrated the courage to question established procedures when they didn't make sense. Sarah Collins was recruited for her extraordinary memory. Margaret O'Brien was included for her insight into executive communications. Alice Wong was essential for her mathematical abilities. Each woman was assigned specific aspects of the analysis to track. Sarah would document the time lost when the new system failed. Margaret would record errors caused by overstandardization. Alice would calculate the additional costs Harrison's inefficiencies were adding to every transaction. The women developed an intricate communication system based on typing rhythms and desk arrangements. A particular pattern of keystrokes meant I found another problem. Placing a pencil at a specific angle on a desk meant I need to meet after work. Most remarkably, they managed to complete Harrison's project according to his specifications, while simultaneously conducting their own analysis, maintaining perfect facades of compliance, while building a detailed critique of everything they were being asked to do. The shadow project operated during lunch breaks, after hours, and on weekends, in apartments, coffee shops, and the ladies' lounge at Grand Central Station. Anywhere they could speak freely. These meetings were extraordinary. The women brought notebooks filled with careful observations and statistical calculations. They debated methodology, challenged assumptions, and developed theoretical frameworks for understanding the relationship between management decisions and operational effectiveness. What emerged was far more than a simple critique of a filing system. The women were creating a systematic analysis of how work actually gets done, how information flows through formal and informal networks, how human factors interact with technical systems to determine overall effectiveness. By mid-August, as Operation Clean Slate neared completion, the women had assembled what Dot privately called the real report, a 127-page analysis that represented the most detailed understanding of Meridian Insurance Company's operations ever compiled. The report combined theoretical sophistication with operational expertise in a way that no traditional business study could have achieved, but they still faced the fundamental problem. How could a group of female typists present a systematic critique of management without being dismissed or fired? The answer came from Ruth Patterson. Her work handling special situations had given her unusual insight into the company's external relationships. She knew that Meridian was being evaluated for a large group insurance contract with the New York City Teachers Union. The contract was a significant opportunity, but winning it required demonstrating operational efficiency to an evaluation committee that included several women who understood the practical requirements of effective customer service. Ruth suggested that instead of trying to present their analysis internally. They should find a way to get their findings into the hands of the Union Evaluation Committee. If external evaluators asked pointed questions based on the women's research, management would have to address the operational inefficiencies, whether they wanted to or not. The plan was audacious and risky. They would be essentially conducting industrial espionage against their own employer. If discovered, they could face not just termination, but criminal charges. After several tense meetings, it was Ruth who made the final case for moving forward. We have knowledge that could make this company work better, improve service for our clients, and make all of our jobs more satisfying. Don't we have an obligation to share that knowledge, even if it means taking some risks? Evelyn volunteered to be the courier. On a Friday evening in late August, she walked 20 blocks south to the teachers' union offices near City Hall. She carried a manila envelope containing multiple copies of the real report, along with a carefully crafted cover letter presenting the analysis as the work of concerned industry professionals. The letter suggested that the evaluation committee might want to ask specific questions about the issues raised in the report to determine whether Meridian had adequate systems in place. The union evaluation meeting took place the following Tuesday. Harrison Whitmore III arrived confident that Operation Clean Slate had positioned Meridian perfectly. But what he encountered was a panel of union representatives who seemed to possess an almost supernatural knowledge of Meridian's internal operations. They asked why the new system had increased the time required to locate client information. They questioned the communication protocols that created bottlenecks. Most challenging of all, they presented alternative approaches that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of insurance operations. Harrison was left unable to provide satisfactory answers to fundamental questions about his company's effectiveness. The teachers' union ultimately awarded the contract to a smaller, more reliable insurance company. The loss of the contract sent shockwaves through Meridian's executive leadership. The board of directors demanded an investigation into how the union had obtained such detailed information. The investigation, however, proved fruitless. The union representatives maintained that their questions were based on industry standard practices. Meanwhile, the women in the typing pool maintained perfect facades of innocence. They expressed surprise and disappointment, wondered aloud about how such issues could have developed, and volunteered to help with any efforts to improve efficiency. Their performance was a masterpiece of subtlety. It was Dot Henderson who provided Harrison with a path to recovery. During one of his desperate attempts to understand what had gone wrong, she offered her perspective. "Well, Mr. Whitmore, I certainly don't understand all the business aspects like you do," she said with careful humility. "But I have noticed a few small things in our daily operations. Would it be helpful if I wrote up some observations from the typing pool's perspective?" Harrison, desperate for any insight, immediately agreed. Within a week, she had submitted a carefully edited version of the real report. entitled Operational Observations from the Typing Pool. The transformation of their analysis from a critique into a collaborative contribution was a masterpiece of strategic communication. It provided Harrison with a way to implement the suggested changes while taking credit for identifying and solving the problems himself. The response was immediate. Harrison found himself reading the most comprehensive and practical analysis of his company's operations he had ever encountered. Within 6 months, virtually every recommendation in the women's report had been implemented, always presented as Harrison's own initiatives. The results exceeded everyone's expectations. Processing times decreased by 35%. Error rates dropped to the lowest levels in the company's history. Customer satisfaction soared. The efficiency gains were substantial enough to offset the loss of the teacher's contract and generate profits that impressed the board, restoring confidence in Harrison's management. Meridian's reputation for operational excellence became a primary competitive advantage, allowing them to win several other major group contracts over the following 2 years. Harrison Whitmore III was promoted to Senior Vice President in charge of operations and became a case study in enlightened management featured in the Harvard Business Review. But the most significant changes were ones that Harrison himself never fully understood. The typing pool had been transformed from a collection of clerical workers into a team of operational analysts whose insights were actively solicited. Dot Henderson was promoted to executive assistant for operational analysis. Evelyn Kowalski became the company's first female statistical analyst. Ruth Patterson was appointed Special Projects Coordinator. 12 other women from the pool received promotions, salary increases, or special assignments that recognized their analytical abilities. The changes rippled throughout Meridian. Women began to be recruited not just for clerical positions, but for roles that required problem-solving skills and business judgment. The rigid hierarchies that had previously determined who could contribute ideas began to blur, replaced by more flexible structures that valued competence over credentials and gender. The story of the typing pool's quiet revolution began to spread through the informal networks of working women throughout the city. The techniques the Meridian women had developed became a model for how knowledgeable workers could challenge organizational hierarchies and contribute to business improvement from the bottom up. What had started as one group's response to a poorly designed filing system became part of a broader movement toward more participatory approaches to workplace organization. The idea that intelligence and insight exist at every level began to gain acceptance in progressive business circles throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Dot Henderson continued working at Meridian for 23 more years, eventually becoming the first woman to serve on the company's board of directors in 1967. She never publicly claimed credit for the efficiency improvements that had transformed the company, but she kept a copy of the original real report in her desk drawer as a reminder of what could be accomplished when intelligent, dedicated people worked together. Evelyn Kowalski left Meridian in 1961 to complete her college degree, subsequently starting her own successful management consulting firm. Ruth Patterson retired in 1972, but not before helping to establish the New York Women's Professional Network, an organization that provided mentoring and advocacy for women seeking to advance in business careers. Their influence and the influence of the 87 women of the typing pool extended far beyond their individual careers. Today, the 32nd floor of the Chrysler Building houses a modern financial services company. The typewriters are long gone, but visitors who know the building's history sometimes report hearing faint echoes of keys clicking in perfect rhythm during the quiet hours after business has ended, the ghostly remnants of a summer when 87 women discovered they possessed the power to change their world. The story reminds us that the most significant revolutions are often the quietest ones, that change can happen through careful observation and persistent effort rather than dramatic confrontation, and that the people who seem to have the least official power sometimes understand the most about how organizations actually function. In the end, the Great Typewriter Pool Reformation of 1952 was not really about filing systems. It was about the recognition that intelligence and insight exist at every level of every organization, waiting to be discovered by leaders who are wise enough to listen and humble enough to learn from the people who do the work. It was about the power of collaboration, the importance of systematic analysis, and the effectiveness of strategic thinking in overcoming barriers, both seen and unseen. It was a quiet revolution, waged with carbon paper and quiet courage, and its echoes can still be heard today. And with that, our gentle journey into this quiet corner of the past comes to a close. May it bring a little stillness to your night, and may the stories of these ordinary heroes remind you of the extraordinary power that lies in quiet observation, careful thought, and the simple, revolutionary act of women working together. Sleep well.